You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Washington's great outdoors, famous for breathtaking mountain views, crystal blue lakes, and roads. You could start seeing more of the last one on your hikes and camping trips in the coming years. That's because President Trump is trying to get rid of the Roadless Rule. It's a 2001 federal policy that prohibits road construction and logging in protected national forests and grasslands. A repeal of the policy could impact close to 45 million acres in the United States, including around 2 million acres in Washington. The administration says the rule is too restrictive, gets in the way of wildfire risk management, and hurts economic development in rural areas. In late August, the federal government opened a public comment period for the proposed rescission of the rule. People have until Friday, September 19th, to share their thoughts. And so far, the news has ignited major backlash from wildlife advocates, outdoor enthusiasts, and tribes. In response, some Indigenous community members have created the Way of the Masks Journey, which is a campaign to oppose the rule's repeal. Participants are traveling across the West Coast to share their support for the Roadless Rule. Alyssa Macy plans to participate in the campaign's Seattle stop this week. Macy is a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs in Oregon, and she's worried about what's going to happen to her surroundings if the Roadless Rule gets overturned.
We believe this is one of the strongest protections for remaining wild forests, and this rule protects natural forest lands from road construction and logging. Native people from Northern California to Alaska, we understand that we are connected to everything. We are a part of an ecosystem, and we have a lot of things in the natural world that protect salmon, that protect us, protect our water. And when you think about the possibility of opening up our forest lands to more roads, what you're talking about is actually degrading the natural environment and the protections that it provides.
Supporters of the Roadless Rule are pointing to the damage that road building and timber harvest could have on salmon populations. Macy considers the repeal a threat to her culture.
For my people, the world without salmon would be an existential crisis. Salmon are at the center of our religious practice and our culture. We made a promise to always protect them. So who would we be without salmon? Who would we be without clean water or clean air?
With the Trump administration bent on repeal, however, supporters of the Roadless Rule may be facing an uphill battle, and many may feel demoralized. Even so, Macy says she's used to fighting for things that matter to her.
For some people, I think it feels really maybe hopeless. But for me as a Native person, I just tell folks, we've been on the defense since first contact. We've always had to fight for the things that we love and cherish, and it doesn't change now. It's maybe a different cast of characters, but it's the same tactics and strategies.
To many people, the Roadless Rule is a high-stakes issue, and there are a lot of key players with different perspectives on the policy. We want to hear from people on both sides about why they are either backing its repeal or fighting for its preservation. So first, someone who wants to get rid of the Roadless Rule. Nick Smith is the Public Affairs Director for the American Forest Resource Council. His organization says repeal is necessary to change an overreaching rule, one they say doesn't fit with the forest management needs of today. Nick, thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So first, can you give us a little background about the American Forest Resource Council? What do you do? Where do you operate? What's the kind of work that you do for forests, especially in the West?
The American Forest Resource Council represents the forest sector in Washington state and 5 other Western states. And we represent everyone from wood products manufacturers, both large and small. We represent small family-owned logging companies. We represent a number of counties, NGOs, and others that all have an interest in sustainable, active forest management on public lands.
And the council released a statement in early September expressing support for the repeal of the Roadless Rule. What are the reasons that you think that this would be good policy?
In our view, the Roadless Rule is a rigid, top-down, one-size-fits-all policy that is not up to the challenges we face in 2025, namely wildfire. More than 8 million acres of roadless areas have burned since the rule was imposed. So What I would say to your listeners is that, rescinding the rule doesn't mandate new roads or logging. As we see it, rescinding the rule restores the ability of land managers to make science-based, site-specific decisions like thinning overstock stands under existing environmental laws.
And what does that mean, thinning overstock stands? How does that affect forests for somebody who's like not in the industry?
We have an epidemic of dead trees on federal lands. We have insects and disease, which has increased tree mortality way above the natural growth rate of these forests here in the Pacific Northwest. And when you have things like drought, insects, and disease, you get dead trees, and dead trees provide fuel for wildfire. And so, thinning an overstock stand, really means kind of thinning out the overgrowth, restoring these landscapes to more natural historic conditions so that when a fire inevitably comes, the wildfire, performs its role in these forests, as opposed to catastrophic, severe wildfires that certainly burn up our forests, harm our air and water quality, degrade wildlife habitat, and other things that we value in our forests.
I think this is a hard point for some people to understand about forest management and the perspective that you're bringing here. You're making the case that we are already intervening in the natural life cycle of these forests by suppressing wildfires, because forests have a natural cycle of burning every, such and such amount of time. And when we suppress the wildfire, the fuels build up, and then that natural cycle becomes a really devastating, gigantic fire that does lasting, much more damage than it would have had we not suppressed the wildfire. Does that make sense? Like, basically, you're saying, the roadless rule on its face is protecting forests, but in fact, our forest policy currently is a type of intervention that causes health issues for forests, and that's why you're arguing to repeal this rule. Am I capturing that correctly?
Well, I think you've described it pretty well. Humans have intervened in forests for millennia. Indigenous people have managed forests for thousands of years, prior to European settlement. And forest policy has a major impact on how these forests fare. The severe wildfires that we're seeing in 2025 are not natural. These are severe fires that really damage a lot of the values that we hold, for our forests, wildlife, clean air, clean water, and other things. And so, my point is 24, 25 years after the imposition of the roadless rule, we think it's fair to take a look at the policy and just ask the question: is this policy, really doing the things that we want it to do?
I've heard from environmental groups the concern about this is going to increase clear cuts, or this is going to increase logging. That's one concern. The other concerns I've heard is that the roads themselves affect how the water moves across the landscape. They create a danger of more erosion. There's a lot of stuff that these roads do beyond just open access for more logging. What's your response to those environmental concerns?
Well, once again, rescinding the roadless rule does not mandate new roads or logging. I think it's important for listeners to understand that, national forests, including those here in the Pacific Northwest, are guided by forest plans. In this case, the Northwest Forest Plan, which governs the management of these lands and provides pretty clear direction in terms of what areas could be managed, what areas can have commercial timber harvests, what areas, are set aside for, aquatic species, wildlife species. And, the Northwest Forest Plan goes back to the mid-90s. It actually predates the roadless rule. And so all of these guidelines under the Northwest Forest Plan apply whether or not the roadless rule is in place.
There are some exceptions already in the roadless rule, especially when it comes to responding to emergencies like wildfires or to mitigate environmental hazards. Do you think that those are sufficient? Does the American Forest Resource Council think that those exceptions are sufficient?
Well, our team of foresters at AFRC work across the West on forest projects on federal lands. And, we have seen cases where roadless designations make it prohibited for public land managers to implement a forest project like thinning an overgrown stand. And so, what I would say is that forest projects, whether or not you have a roadless rule, must undergo that site-specific environmental review, that public input, and that scientific analysis before proceeding. So that's not changing if the roadless rule is rescinded. The rescission of the roadless rule just simply removes a blanket top-down prohibition on considering access. And so there are cases where you rescind the roadless rule. Public land managers may decide for whatever reason that they can't go out in there and reduce wildfire risks for certain reasons.
So there is this campaign underway that we've been talking about to draw attention to this public comment period before the roadless rule can be rescinded. And they're saying that they think that this is going to be damaging to the health of forests and to the future of our local public lands. Just a final thought here from the American Forest Resource Council, your response to their message, and then is there a world in which all of these different needs can be met?
That's a really good question. Let me try to tackle that. I would say that the need for more flexible, proactive forest management has never been greater, considering half of all roadless acres are facing high wildfire risk. And, I would say that, there's areas for common ground. I think a lot of that can be found in how do we modernize the Northwest Forest Plan? There have been a lot of conversations over the past couple of years, and there's broad consensus, including tribal voices, conservation, industry, and others, that this plan that was written in '94, are not helping us address the challenges posed by climate change, wildfire, and other threats. And so, I think there is space for diverse interests to come together and find areas where we can achieve good forest policy that results in good outcomes for everybody. The roadless rule, as a rigid sort of top-down, one-size-fits-all policy, just is not doing the job of protecting forests in 2025.
Nick Smith is the Public Affairs Director for the American Forest Resource Council. Thank you, Nick. I appreciate the time today.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. So we just heard some arguments about why some in the forestry industry want to see the roadless rule repealed. When we come back, we're going to hear a response from the Sierra Club detailing the impact of ending it. That's in just a minute, right here on KUOW. Back with more Soundside, I'm Libby Denkman, and I'm discussing the Roadless Rule, a 2001 federal policy that prohibits road construction and logging on tens of millions of acres of protected national forests and grasslands. The Trump administration has started the process to repeal it, citing issues like wildfire prevention and concerns about overly burdensome regulations. This could affect about 2 million acres of public lands in Washington state. Now we're going to turn to somebody who's worried that if the roadless rule gets overturned, it could completely upend the ecology in these protected areas. Leah Brewster is a conservation campaign strategist at the Sierra Club, and she's involved with the Way of the Masks journey that we talked about with Alyssa Macy earlier. Hi, Leah. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
What are your primary concerns from an environmental perspective if the roadless rule were to be repealed?
Yeah, so I think it really helps to look at the context of the history of the roadless rule and why it came to be in the first place. Prior to the roadless rule in 2001, logging was moving along pretty rapidly. We were rapidly losing these untouched places, and the Forest Service itself recognized that that was going to be an issue for a number of reasons. Economically, the number of roads that we had was out of hand, and they were already just had this huge maintenance backlog for these roads. They were also seeing that it was these last untouched landscapes that we were going to lose, and kind of recognizing the ecological importance of these places. And that hasn't changed. These are still incredibly important places for habitat for animals. There's over 1,600 endangered and threatened species that call these places home. They're also the watersheds that provide clean drinking water for about 60 million people across the US. And they're also the places where salmon spawn, which for us in the Pacific Northwest is obviously an incredibly crucial piece. It's sort of the marrow of the bone of these places. It's the last and best of what we have. So that means that everything comes together there. They're a place where all these issues become interconnected. So for us, it's a hugely important place to preserve and care for because it is absolutely irreplaceable if we were to lose our roadless places.
We just heard from Nick Smith at the American Forest Resource Council that the roadless rule, from their perspective, is harmful red tape and unnecessary. He says that the roadless rule hinders wildfire prevention, for example, because you're not able to get in and do the kind of work like thinning and removal of excess dried fuels that have built up over the years because of wildfire mitigation efforts. We've heard from others that say that the rule harms economic growth and local businesses. What are your thoughts about these arguments?
So when you talk about putting in more roads to reduce wildfires, it's a bit like saying we need more matches to prevent house fires, like exactly the opposite effect of what we're looking for here. And we know that because 85% of all wildfires are actually human caused. That's from Washington State DNR. We also know that 90% of wildfires start within a half mile of a road. And that's because roads bring in more people, but also more machinery, trucks, all these things that actually can spark fires in these places. And if we want to keep places safe from wildfire, the best thing we can do is to keep them in their natural fire adapted state. These are untouched places. These are not the places that have been logged and regrown improperly. These are places that are as they were prior to all of that. So these places are more fire resilient naturally, and we should be leaving them alone, not building more roads into them.
Nick also mentioned that there are forest plans that already protect the forests that you're specifically talking about and allow a certain amount of logging in specific places. But he said that that the roadless rule is really unnecessary on top of the other protections that the forests have. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember the context that we're in right now. We have multiple layers of protections for these places, and all of those layers are currently under attack from the Trump administration. We have things like a move to change the Endangered Species Act so that harming a species would only count as harm if the species were directly harmed, not if their habitat was harmed, which is something that would affect areas which can and cannot be logged pretty dramatically. We're also seeing a limit on public input and the process for public input. We're having comment periods massively reduced. Projects aren't being announced. We also have a new federal budget, which calls for a massive increase in the amount of logging that the Forest Service will be doing. And they're going to be looking to do that someplace. So it's not just about, hey, we have all these other safeguards in place and we can rely on that. Currently, all of those safeguards are being eroded. So taking away a blanket protection could have just ginormous consequences down the road.
What do you hope comes from this campaign, Leah?
I think the best thing we can do is to amplify like Indigenous and tribal voices around these issues. They have just such an incredible track record of really leading the way on a lot of these environmental issues, whether that's been around coal export terminals or salmon restoration. And I think that's because the perspective that they've brought to these issues is much more about kind of looking forward to the future than it is about extractive short-term profit. And as people who also live in these places and literally downstream of the effects of what happens in roadless areas, I think it's really important that we listen to that perspective and amplify it and do whatever we can to help.
It strikes me that this is kind of that classic story where you have industry groups, people in the timber industry saying, we need to get rid of some of these bureaucratic layers in order to more effectively manage forests and maximize the economic benefit. As you know, they're not saying we're going to clear cut everything, but they want to maximize economic benefit for local businesses and communities. And then you have environmental groups and tribes pushing back and saying these are precious resources and they don't want to see this incursion. Is there a world in which all of these different needs and concerns can coexist, do you think?
I think there is. And I think what that looks like is that roadless areas are not all of our Forest Service lands. They are specific places that have been set aside because they're so important, and that a solution in which everyone finds benefit maintains those places as protected special areas and looks for that solution in the remaining land. If we're looking at it as how can we find a balance for economic benefit, I think that conversation is clearer and more straightforward. I think where I have more issue is when it's couched as a way to keep communities safe from wildfire. When in terms of fuel treatment work and all of that, the Roadless Rule already allows us to do those things within roadless areas. Currently, like 30% of all fuels treatment work that includes things like thinning and prescribed fire that the Forest Service is doing is already in roadless areas, and roads can already be built if it's for those reasons. So the only reason to get rid of the rule is to do things that wouldn't be justifiable in that way. If that was like the real motivation, we wouldn't be seeing things like the staffing cuts at the Forest Service that would allow us to analyze and move those projects forward. And we would not be seeing, like the rule already allows for us to do those things. There's no need to get rid of it for that reason. So if we're looking for economic solutions, I think that could be done in these areas that aren't the kind of special and preserved areas. But saying that we need to do it for community safety is where I sort of lose the thread.
I mean, it seems as though this is just one example of the many ways in which the Trump administration is rolling back regulation in different areas, including the environment. Is there any world in which the roadless rule survives?
I think there is, similar to the public land sell-off that we saw in the budget earlier this year and kind of the successful pushback against that. It really depends on whether people recognize the importance of this moment and whether we can get people to sort of join in with us and make this all a bit louder so that we'll be heard, because it really takes making something pretty massively unpopular for the administration to listen at this point. And one thing we're worried about with the roadless rule in particular is that the roadless rule doesn't just limit logging in these places, it also prohibits mining and mineral extraction. And we've been seeing a lot of rhetoric coming out of the administration lately about energy dominance and things along those lines. And if we open up these areas, we might not just be seeing timber, we might also be seeing a huge amount of extraction happening in these places, which makes a lot of sense when you consider that we have the first ever Forest Service chief who's not a career Forest Service employee. Like, we're really opening up, I think, to more than we realize when we lose these protections right now.
Leah Brewster with the Sierra Club, thank you very much.
Thank you, Libby.
And if you want to weigh in on the roadless rule or the effort to either keep it or repeal it, you can leave us a voicemail at 206-221-3213. And we will share how to weigh in on that public comment period this round and the next one that is coming up on our website at KUOW.org. Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.